It doesn't really matter what your political position is on anything if your vote doesn't count.
It's the fundamental act of being a citizen. It is, you know, that casting of the vote. And it should put the citizen as close to the process as possible.
Ballots are the bright line between civility and chaos. They are what separates rogue nations from free ones.
We know that our election process is not good. We know that there are a lot of problems with it.
If a voting machine makes an error, either unintentionally or through malice, I want there to be a very good chance that it'll be caught.
It's gone from those ballots being physical documents that anybody can look at and read, being counted in plain open sight, to those documents now being turned into digital ephemeral data and being counted inside a black box machine on proprietary software.
The computer says, I counted 1, 2, 3, and no matter how many times you ask the computer, it's going to say, I counted 1, 2, 3. Maybe the voter marked 3, 2, 1, but there's no way to see that because there's nothing, it's off in cyberspace.
A piece of paper is durable and permanent and transparent to anyone who wants to look at it, whereas a piece of digital data is ephemeral and can be changed like that, and nobody would know about it.
There are a lot of things that, that cause one to wonder about the wisdom of handing over our voting process to private corporations. Not only the heads of these companies and their support of certain political parties, there's also fraud in the background of these companies.
They're saying trust us, and I don't. I don't have any reason to believe they're doing bad things, but I don't want to trust anyone with the integrity of my vote. I'll trust a group of people with different interests, you know, people from different political parties watching the polls, but I don't want to put the control of my government in the hands of a voting machine company.
It has been said that those who vote are not as important as those who count the votes. That's the theme of the program you're about to see. Most people today would be outraged at any effort to take away their right to vote. Yet, under the guise of voting reform, that is exactly what may well happen in the days ahead. It started with the vote recount in Florida, following the 2000 presidential election. The media focused on an antiquated punch card system with imperfectly punched circles called hanging chad, and these caused counting machines to produce inaccurate results. The impression was that punch card systems are not reliable, and they should be replaced by something more appropriate for this modern age of computer technology. What was never mentioned was that not all punch card systems are alike, and the one in Florida was known to be based on bad technology. It required holes to be pushed out by hand using a stylus or a pencil, and that often leaves pieces hanging to the card. That's why many other states used small devices that punch holes with great precision. With those devices, hanging chad was never a serious problem. Optical devices that scan ink markings on paper ballots also have worked well with relatively few problems. In these systems, a recount is simple. It may take time and manpower, but it can be done with confidence in the results. After all, the recount is performed on the same ballots used by the voters. And yet the public was led to believe that all punch cards and paper ballots were bad choices for voting systems, especially when we now have computer technology to make everything more efficient and accurate. And so a group of computer manufacturing companies quickly recognized a commercial market for their products, and the lobbying began. In 2003, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act. It mandated every voting district in America to abandon paper-based voting systems, no matter how inexpensive or reliable they were, and replace them with electronic systems costing millions of dollars per district. The selling point was that touchscreen machines would reduce errors and also provide better access for the handicapped. Both of these issues will be addressed in this program. But the one issue that was seldom mentioned is that touchscreen systems are not designed to produce tangible ballots. If an election is close, a meaningful recount would be impossible. Did the machines work properly? Were they rigged? We would never know. All we could do is push the button a second time. And of course, no matter how many times we did that, the results would always be the same. In these machines, the voting record exists only in computer circuit boards and memory chips. In other words, these systems are designed to count invisible ballots.
And most important premise of American voting today, and what we've had for quite a long time now in our system, is the secret ballot. I mean, it used to be that, you know, people would vote by going into the town square and holding up their hands, and everybody knew how everybody was voting.
At first, it was people voted just by calling out who they were for. So there was no secrecy to the ballot. And of course, you could see where intimidation would take place and vote selling and that sort of thing. So eventually, people started using paper ballots, but there was no standardized way of using these things.
The problem was that the ballot wasn't secret because the parties created the ballots. And they very often were of different color and different size. So you could deposit a ballot into the ballot box, but people watching could see which party's ballot you deposited.
Around 1856, in Victoria, Australia, there was they devised a standardized way of voting by paper ballot. And it really became the gold standard that is still used today. The ballot was standardized, all the candidates were listed on it, the government paid for the printing of the ballot, every voter got one ballot, they were allowed to mark it privately, but it was being cast and counted publicly.
We used paper ballots originally all throughout the country in all of our elections up until the turn of the century, when the automatic voting machine was developed, the lever machine. The early lever machines had all of those choices register through a lever, a little lever that you push up or down. And there's this great 1957 promotional video of the automatic voting machine company that shows how those lever machines were marketed at that time, which is eerily similar to how the touchscreen voting machines are marketed today.
The tools which our average citizen uses every day in his job of work has become fantastically automatic and fast as industry moves to automation. And of course, voting machines are not a new idea. Many new functions have been added, of course. Their use has steadily increased until last year, in 35 states and territory of Hawaii, about half of our American voters voted by machine. Why? Why? Well, it's so fast and so easy.
Eventually, the machines were converted to electronic, and instead of a lever, you would press a button and it would send an electromechanical signal into the machine to create an electronic vote. Electronic voting systems started being implemented in the late 1990s. What's, supposedly the most modern voting system are these fully computerized voting systems that use a touchscreen terminal or something like that.
When you're looking at a touchscreen system, or what they call a DRE, a direct recording electronic, so it's some sort of kiosk where the votes are going in and then they're recorded internally to it. That seems most analogous to the old style lever machines.
We've basically gone from largely paper-based voting systems that rely a little bit on software to count the ballots to totally computerized voting systems that are entirely paperless, have no audit trail, and no ability to verify the accuracy of those automated vote totals.
If a voting machine makes an error, either unintentionally or through malice, I want there to be a very good chance that it'll be caught. Just like if there's a banking error through an accidental error in arithmetic or through embezzlement, that there's a high probability of that being caught.
After the Florida 2000 vote counting problems, there was this, widespread hand-wringing that went on across the country. Why are we using these old voting systems?
Well, Florida was a terrible situation, but it was not the fault of the system. The implementation of the system, however, is crucial. And Florida apparently had never had a close contest. They never received a close look at what they're doing. And it turned out they did not have standards as to what a hanging chad should be or shouldn't be, and which California has had for years. You can have the best system in the world, but if it's not properly executed, it's not going to do its job.
Americans were shocked to discover some of these flaws, some of these glitches in the election process, and you can remember them holding up those ballots and looking at those chads and all that.
After that Florida November 2000 fiasco, they went to touchscreen voting all across the state, all at one time. Huge influx of money. They had their next election was the primary of 2002. It was the biggest disaster in the history of voting, but since it was a primary, it wasn't close, nobody was looking at it. I mean, they had just one disaster after another.
The problem we had in Florida 2002 was that in the same 3 counties, some of the same counties that we had problems with the punch cards, we now had problems with the DRE machines in the 2002 Janet Reno primary. Again, another 250,000 votes vanished into bowels of the machines. We don't know where they were. They disappeared. They were pulled out by some sort of extraction process, and all sorts of havoc was taking place again. And after that, the Help America Vote Act legislation did go through and pass.
The Help America Vote Act provides billions of dollars in federal funding. We're still not sure how much will eventually be authorized, but the original bill was $3.9 billion in federal matching funds to states that eliminate older voting systems, which are specifically described as the punch card and the lever voting machines. The Help America Vote Act also includes a mandate that every polling place in the country provide at least one machine that allows a disabled or blind voter to cast a secret ballot without assistance.
There's some $3.8 billion of federal tax money that is available to the states, sort of dangling out there as like a carrot. You can get this money if you change some of your voting systems, if you centralize your voter registration databases, if you get some additional disabled accessible equipment, and asking the states to do this in order to get the money.
These are huge contracts. LA County, if it were to go all touchscreen, which their Registrar of Voters wants to do, would cost $100 million just to purchase the machines.
There's nothing in the Help America Vote Act that speaks to the ongoing cost of touchscreen voting.
Making the warehouses, updating them so that we can, store this equipment properly. Being able to cover the additional costs of the personnel that are going to have to take care of this, and in some cases this is fairly extensive because the regular personnel that they've had, even on election day, can't handle this equipment.
I mean, here's the machine that I use. A touchscreen machine weighs about 40 pounds, needs to be continuously plugged in because the battery will run down otherwise. It takes an army to deliver them all across the county, 4,000 machines. There is not a facility in this building that would support it. I'd have to go to an outside building and rent it, put in all kinds of electrical stuff in order to have 4,000 machines lined up.
What happens 10 years down the road when all this equipment begins to break down? We spent $3.8 billion. We're going to spend another $3.8 billion? Is the federal government going to fork that over, or is that going to be taken up by the states and the communities?
My motivation for getting involved in politics in the first place is to try to build trust in the process. Self-government doesn't work unless we believe it works. So I've been interested in voting, what motivates people to vote or not to vote.
Voting is not like anything else. It's not like your ATM. It's not like paying your bills. It's not like these functions that you do over and over again throughout the day, week, and year, where you always have confirmation of what you did.
I think that the voting transaction is the most complex and difficult transaction to do securely that anyone could think of because of the unique nature of the secret ballot.
Imagine if a bank had to do business and at the end of the day throw away all the information about who made what transaction. But that's the security requirement we have for voting machines, is they can't keep the information on who voted for whom, and yet they have to be secure. So it's a very challenging problem.
In the case of voting, we have to be able to cast our ballots anonymously, and we also want to be able to audit it for correctness. Like, take your bank ATMs, for example. There's a little camera staring at you that's, you know, seeing you actually take your money out of the ATM. You know who went up to the ATM to put new money in it and who collected those little pieces of envelopes at the end of the day. So all of that is completely auditable. Every single transaction is audited.
On election day in California, at the beginning of the voting day, the poll workers are required in the procedures to open up the ballot box and show the first voter who comes in to the polling place that the box is empty. And similarly, in New York, when it comes to opening up the polling places on those mechanical lever machines, 2 poll workers have to sign a sworn statement saying that they opened up the machine, they looked at the counters on the back of the machine, and they said 0. So we have these procedures that provide the kind of transparency that the public needs to make sure that we can trust the outcome of elections. We haven't replicated these procedures in computerized voting systems. I mean, when you go to a touchscreen machine, if you're the first voter, you can see, I mean, they'll print out a tape of the machine before the election that shows on the paper record that everything's set to 0. But the poll workers aren't opening up the back of the machine and looking at the software and seeing that the software doesn't have any pre-stored votes in there.
People know how to use computers for mundane things, and they know how to build products with computers in them. And if you're not worried about security, whether somebody can modify the software in the program, in the computers, or you're not striving for extremely high levels of reliability, it's straightforward to do. And so people have gotten involved in computerizing voting processes without having the knowledge or proper appreciation for how difficult the task is that they're taking on.
You know, an electronically recorded vote renders a recount meaningless. Whatever count the machine gives you 5 minutes after the polls close is the same count that it will give you a week later if a judge calls for a recount. I had an election a few years ago where on election night my opponent was declared the winner because the county clerk made a pencil and paper error, just assigned 9,000 votes to the wrong column. 9,000 votes was a big enough error, it was pretty easy to find. It's pretty easy to spot. If that had happened electronically, it may be that no one would have ever known.
There are basically 2 things that could go wrong with an election when it comes to counting the votes. Number 1, someone made a mistake. And accidents happen in elections all the time.
The real danger, in my opinion, as a computer technician, is the simple, everyday glitches, problems, bugs that exist in computer software, which means you can get the wrong results despite your best intentions. And the problem is you could get the wrong results and not even realize your results are wrong.
And I've got plenty of examples that document the kinds of unintentional problems that have come up in elections, where someone failed to check the software, someone didn't do the tests before the election that they were supposed to do, or where the software was misprogrammed so the candidates' names were switched, so the results that were released were actually the reverse. I mean, this happens all the time.
In place after place that are deploying these systems, in Dallas, Texas, a couple of years ago, you had machines where when you pressed for the Democratic candidates, it would only light up for the Republican candidates. There was also 3 different precincts where it was fairly certain that when you cast votes for this one particular candidate, her name would be lit up and then it would blink off.
The other kind of problem that you have is someone intentionally trying to change the outcome of an election through by committing voter fraud.
There are smart computer people out there, and just think of a disgruntled voting machine company employee. Not that he wants to turn the election to Bush or to Gore or to any local candidate, but just wants to create a little bit of havoc, a little bit of mischief.
People say there's been no fraud in touchscreen machines. Well, nobody really knows whether there's been fraud or not. There's absolutely no way to check.
With the computerized voting systems, The public is wholly dependent on their local election official, who is then in turn wholly dependent on their vendor to get everything right. And there have been plenty of examples where something broke down on election night, the vote counting server didn't work, you couldn't get ballots out of a machine.
Houston, Texas, just recently had a problem during the 2003 election. The election officials had gone in there and were trying to set up the machines to use and couldn't get the machines to work. So here voters are coming in, they're lining up, they want to vote, and they can't get the machines to work. The solution that they came up with was to start tearing up pieces of paper and getting people to sit down and write. They gave them a sample ballot and then told them to write down their votes on a piece of paper. So that they have no plan. There's no contingency plan of what do we do if these machines don't work.
In reality, nobody in the government or the press knows in many of these cases, and maybe the vendors don't know either. A lot of these things, the vendor says, oh yeah, we're investigating it, and then it gets dropped on the floor, including major problems like the governor's race in Alabama being apparently decided by machine error. Something funky happened with the machine. ES&S said we're looking into it, and that's the last we heard about it.
It always goes back to some spokesperson for the company that sold the voting system, assuring the public that, yes, we had this glitch, but we got it all worked out, and maybe we lost a couple votes here and there, but it wasn't enough to change the outcome of any election. That's the line I've read over and over again. It wasn't enough to change the outcome of any election. How do you know that? How do you know that? You don't know that. What I find the most galling of the arguments that come from the proponents of the touchscreen voting systems and these companies who say that we should trust them and that voter fraud isn't a problem, and we don't have a problem with voter fraud. I mean, that is the most ridiculous thing that I hear, because every election there's a risk of voter fraud. We wouldn't go through all the security that we go through in the first place if we didn't believe that there's a risk of voter fraud. And people try to cheat in elections all the time, and maybe they're not stuffing ballot boxes, but people always come up with ways.
I was thinking, if I was going to tamper with an election, well, first of all, what kind of person would want to tamper with an election? And everyone seems to assume, oh, the candidate wants to go out and rig his own election. That's not necessarily how I look at it.
Think of all the other people who would want to mess with elections. Foreign governments, major contractors who get a lot of money from the government, whose economic future is depending on federal policy, organized crime. So lots of entities who would be highly motivated to mess with elections and can bring to bear lots of resources to do that. They could easily bribe people in the companies. They could probably buy the companies.
If you were going to buy an election, what kind of people would you go to give your money to? In an electronic voting system, the people who have direct access to the votes are the programmers and also the support technicians. And then one of the things that I would do if I was looking at buying them off, you don't want to approach the wrong person because they might tell on you. So you would want to find somebody who had a record, or somebody who had financial problems. You would kind of get an idea as to who to approach. And I also called some programmers. I say, if you wanted to rig one of these machines, how would you do it? And they would tell me how you would go about it precisely. And as we started talking about what things to do, it was like a challenge for these guys, and some of them were like, well, I could rig one of these. One guy would say, well, you could put together a special kind of ballot that would go through, and you could rig the election by casting a vote.
I walk up to the voting machine, and instead of touching the candidate that I want, I get 4 fingers out and I put them in particular spots on the screen at the same time, and I enable a secret mode that nobody knows about, but I have a contact who was one of the programmers of this machine, and at that point it changes the tally to make 90% of the votes be for the candidate I wanted.
It's a really interesting idea, because all this testing they say they do. They always say, well, we run lots of ballots through the machines before the election, we know they count right. But if no one triggers the fix, it's going to count right.
There's nothing that you can do when you're testing the machine to test for that except trying every combination of fingers on the screen that you can think of, which is not part of the normal testing procedure of these machines.
If I was going to tamper with a national election and try to do something on a national scale, say a presidential scale, I don't know that I would write some special algorithm in, to just flip votes to one candidate. I think I would do something that was still more strategic and say, well, we've got certain key states, like Florida. We've got certain key areas within those states, and I would go after those, and I would probably do it with a triggering mechanism so that it was something that was built in, because you can do that with a very small amount of code. And it was sort of sitting there waiting, and when the signal comes, that way you could put such a thing into all the programs nationwide and then just invoke it in the ones you want.
This insider threat that I mentioned, some detractors of it say, well, that's crazy, that would never happen. I can point to 2 examples of cases where insider programmers actually changed systems for some benefit. There was a case in Nevada where somebody who worked for the Slot Machine Testing Commission wrote a program and put it on a testing device. He did not put it on a slot machine. What this program did is when the testing officials would randomly show up at a casino to test a slot machine to see if it's behaving correctly, they would attach this device that would perform the test. And this guy was really clever. At that point, code that he wrote would go onto the slot machine. What did that code do? Well, it did nothing in the usual case. So the slot machine would continue to behave the way it had until a particular sequence of coins were inserted into it. When that particular sequence of coins were inserted into the slot machine, it became a winning machine, and it just started winning all the time. This was an insider. He worked for the Gaming Commission. He wrote software for the testing devices. And it was clever to hide the code in the testing device and not in the slot machine, so that when a device was tested, it would pass, but it would also turn it into something that could be turned into a winning machine. Another example was the Breeders' Cup, which is a horse race in New Jersey, where one of the programmers of the system, they were trying to upgrade the betting system, and one of the programmers put some logic in that would allow them to dial in and enter a code to change a bet that had happened. So let's say you came in and you put in $10,000 on horse 1, and then you watched the race, and right at the end of the race it was clear horse 4 was going to win. You could actually dial in and change your bet, the same amount of money, to be on 4. And this worked for a long time until he won $3 million. The point is, how many times have things like this happened where the person didn't get greedy and didn't get caught? And when it comes to our voting systems, I'm not so much worried about the big headlines that you see from time to time about a voting machine counted 144,000 votes when only 19,000 voters were registered, which was a headline recently. I'm worried about the one where 20% of the votes changed from one candidate to the other and nobody found out about it.
I stumbled across Bev Harris's sign where she was talking about voting machines and the ownership of the stock in voting machine companies, specifically ES&S, and how you had a United States senator who had owned stock in a company that was counting votes for his own election. We had a couple of phone calls discussing that topic, and I just out of the blue asked her, I said, have you ever considered doing a book on this?
We had envisioned it as a very short book, maybe 100, 120, 150 pages. Just simple, let them know that this is something we should look at in the future. And we were kind of winding it up. And David Allen said, well, we don't know anything about these touchscreen machines. It's really frustrating. He went to try to look at one. We weren't allowed to look at it. We weren't allowed to, find out how they work. And he said, you really need to get a hold of a technical manual. Of course, they don't publish those on the websites of the voting machine companies. I went to ES&S. That was the big one I was really looking at the time. And it said info@essvote.com for more information. And I thought, oh, well, maybe the people who work there have essvote.com on their email. And so I put essvote.com in Google search engine. And sure enough, I found about 40 people who work for ES&S, and I found all kinds of information about them, where they like to go for vacations and where they went to high school and what they do. And one of them was afraid she was about to lose her job, and I thought, wow, if I was going to go mess with a programmer, I would know how to get them now. And I would even know which ones to approach. And I thought, well, let me just go get some more names. So I'll go get Sequoia voting system names. And I got some of them, and then I thought, I'll go get Diebold now. And I found that they had been called Global Election Systems. They had purchased it quite recently, actually. And so the Global Election Systems email was called GESN.com, and I put that into Google search, and I'm busily copying down the names of the different programmers that pop out. There was quite a few, and just going page by page, and it took me to a page. It was an old Global Election Systems web page, and I thought, well, let me just take a look through this and see what I can find. And there was one little button that said FTP, and I didn't quite know what that would take me to. So I clicked it, and it just took me to this page that had a bunch of files on it, file folders on it. And I had seen those kinds of things sometimes before, and I never really got that, what it meant when you go there and you just see file names. And so I called up David Allen, and I said, what am I looking at here? You know, what is this? I see files. And he looks at it, and he says, this is incredible stupidity. These people have put all their stuff on the web. And what they had done, it was like, it's like what you do on your computer, where you have a bunch of files where you keep stuff, only they kept it on the web, and it was a filing system for the company. And there was about 40,000 files on this site. It looked like it had been put there over a period of about 6 years. It wasn't something they just accidentally left on the web. It was something they had been using as a storage bin.
These are the touchscreen machines made by Diebold, plus the software required to tally, collect and tally the votes in an election. Completely out in the open, on the net, publicly available. And it appeared to me to be a site for tech support technicians and things like this to upload and download latest revisions of the files, patches. If they were having problems in the field, they could take a file and upload it for the programmers back home to look at. This is not unusual. These type of sites can be found all over the place. What was unusual was there was absolutely no security on it. There was not even a single, quote, no trespassing sign.
So they had all the technical manuals. I said, did I do good? I found some.
Pretty much the blueprints to the vault. Everything that you would need to know if you were going to look to hack one of these machines. Everything was there. Certification specifications, technical manuals, equipment specifications, actual source code, along with comments, from the programmers that we were finding in there, where they were talking about, well, this kind of procedure hasn't worked, and well, we'll change this and hope it works. Or we keep coming up with this error and we don't know why we come up with this error. This is not the kind of stuff that you want to be reading when you're looking at coding for something as sensitive as a federal election.
I got a call from Professor David Dill from Stanford, and he called and asked me if I had heard that the code for the Diebold voting machine was available on the internet. And he explained to me that this was one of the primary vendors of electronic touchscreen voting machines, and that companies typically are very proprietary about the code, and it's not public, so no one's ever had a chance to see what's going on inside these machines. He asked me if I was interested in doing a security analysis of the code in this machine. A couple of hours later, after we hung up the phone, Adam Stubblefield came running into my office saying that he couldn't believe how bad the code was, and there were all kinds of security problems. He just noticed it right away.
The fact that they were using a database program called Microsoft Access, which is a great consumer product, but has absolutely no business being used for any kind of sensitive database applications such as our vote. It's a database that can be easily manipulated. All you need is a copy of Microsoft Access. You can open up and change any of the results.
By the end of 2 weeks, we had finished a 24-page report which outlined all kinds of security vulnerabilities. And the day before we were going to go public with the report, I went to the Diebold site just to see some things, and I really didn't know that much about Diebold. And at the top of the web page was a headline saying, the state of Maryland announces a $55.6 million purchase of 11,000 Diebold voting machines. And this was the day before we were going to release a report saying that those machines are totally insecure. So the New York Times the next day ran a story. It was not a front page story, but it was a reasonable sized story, basically summarizing our report. The Washington Post the next day ran a front page story on it, as did the Baltimore Sun.
The significant thing about the Johns Hopkins report was that it forced Diebold to finally have to respond to the criticisms of its system. Up until then, Diebold was able to dismiss criticism as the work of crackpots or the opinions of hysterics. But here was a group of very skilled and serious academics who very systematically went through the software to discover things that were wrong with it.
Diebold came at me pretty hard. The people who had certified the Diebold voting machines tried to get me fired and came after me and never contacted me directly, but contacted the university's president and the head of our institute here and tried to create a lot of friction for me unsuccessfully.
Well, actually, in 2002, in the election, I was by this time concerned, in November 2002, by this time concerned about these voting machines. And one of the states I was most interested in was Georgia. And the reason I was interested is because they had made a bulk purchase of touchscreen unauditable machines. And I believe it was the only state at that point. They had the same machines statewide, all unauditable. And so we were very interested to see what would happen in Georgia. We were watching the polls pretty closely to see if there was a difference, you know, or a bigger difference or any discrepancies. And Georgia had 6 upsets.
You had a Republican for the first time since the Civil War gain control of the governor's office, which totally flew in the face of the polls prior to that.
And so Georgia was really disturbing, and nobody could check what happened in Georgia because there was no way to recount anything or audit anything because there were no paper ballots at all in the whole state.
Bev was searching through the files, you know, trying to understand what the various files are. And, you know, typical of software, you wind up with files with very cryptic names that you know, make perfect sense to the programmer but make absolutely no sense to anyone else. So in trying to understand files and what they are and what they're doing, she stumbled across a folder called Rob Georgia.
Well, one of the things I did was I wanted to see if Rob was a verb or a noun. So I thought I'll call up Diebold and ask him, is there a guy named Rob who works in Georgia? And they insisted there was not. But then I got an email, and the email said, maybe I'm the Rob you're looking for. I'm the Rob they say there doesn't exist, or some such thing. He was such a straightforward, nice guy. It was one of the most straightforward interviews I was able to get. Usually when you interview voting people, they dodge all over the place and you can't get a straight answer and you have to ask it 6 different ways. But I would say to Rob Georgia, what do you think Rob Georgia was? And he'd say, it was a patch.
A patch is a fix. Kind of like how you'll patch a tire, that's where the term comes from. If you get a hole in your tire, you put a patch on it and then it's fixed. Same thing with the program. If the program has a hole in it, it has an error, it's instead of going back and rewriting the entire code, you change just the code necessary to fix the problem.
This company had probably sold its biggest contract ever in the history of United States elections when they sold the whole state of Georgia. And it was kind of, as these things are, they were, you know, really scrambling and things were going wrong and so forth. So they shipped these machines. Supposedly they're supposed to go through all this testing. They're supposed to be tested at the national certifier and tested at the state level, and then they're supposed to be tested at the factory. Each machine is supposed to have the initials of the person who personally tested it, and then they test it again when it arrives at the state. Well, Rob had that job of testing it when it arrives at the state.
He was working in the Diebold warehouse as its deployment manager. Basically, he handled 22,000 machines throughout the state. In Diebold's warehouse, he set them up, got them ready, shipped them out to the counties. He told us that there were numerous problems with the machines, that they were not booting up, they were freezing or crashing, or the real-time clock in the machines was set for the wrong date, the wrong time, and so it was affecting the functionality.
And he goes on a Saturday and he opens up a pallet of machines and realizes that 25% of the machines are failing right from the get-go. This was in June, the election was in November, but they had a lot of work to do before then. So he calls the rest of the folks in and says, we have a problem here.
Diebold and engineers had sent him and his crew patches. He counted 3 patches in all. We know a 4th one that was put on the systems after that. These patches were never certified. Diebold simply handed them down to the people in the warehouse and said apply them to all 22,000 machines.
I looked up Georgia law, and it says you may not make any modifications without recertifying. Putting a modification on will decertify the system.
the software is supposed to be certified. The election software is supposed to be checked out by what's called an ITA, an independent testing authority, who will look at the software and make sure that it's appropriate for what it's supposed to do. It knows how to count. There's nothing funny going on as far as how votes are assigned or tallied, that it complies with applicable state and federal law. You know, once the software has been certified, that version of the software can be used in the field and no other.
Diebold would tell you that they weren't major changes, and so that's why they wouldn't have to tell anyone about them. It comes to a process of relying on the vendor to certify themselves, basically, to tell us what the patch does, to tell us that it doesn't do anything that it shouldn't do, and to tell us that we should trust them, basically.
You literally had some guy in Canada staying up, burning the midnight oil at the office, writing something, we don't know what, that ended up controlling the counting of 1 million votes.
If they're not using certified software, you have to ask why. And then you have to ask whether there's a possibility somebody tinkered with the voting machines, or, as I believe, there's a possibility that the machines didn't perform correctly. The official explanation was that the Republicans did a whole lot of last-minute get-out-the-vote efforts that had paid off. But some people began looking at these voting machines and saying, well, you know, did they function correctly?
A lot of Georgia activists did just heroic work, you know, going from place to place and talking to legislators and talking to the Secretary of State. But they just, everybody just kind of shrugged.
The state of Maryland decided that because they were going to go ahead with this purchase and our study had created such an uproar, that they were going to have their own investigation of the Diebold voting machines. And they contracted SAIC, which is a defense contractor with a lot of security expertise, to do a study of these machines. They basically validated everything that we had said in our report. In the executive summary, they said that the Diebold voting machines were highly vulnerable to compromise, and they went on to point out many flaws and labeled 26 of them as critical flaws. It's interesting to note that nobody made any mention of the fact that had we not done our study, they would not have even done the SAIC study, and nobody would have fixed these machines.
This report came out and it stated pretty unequivocally that there were things wrong with the system and that there were things seriously wrong that needed to be fixed immediately. However, the report was presented in such a way, along with the state of Maryland officials, as if this was something that no one should actually be concerned about. So there was this mixed message coming out that if you actually read the report, you found that there were a number of things that you should be concerned about, and yet everyone talking about the report, including Diebold, including state of Maryland officials and SAIC people, were saying that it really wasn't something that we should be concerned about.
While all this is going on, the state of Ohio put about $126 million purchase of Diebold machines on hold as well, and commissioned several studies by groups other than SAIC to look at the voting machines of 4 companies, Diebold, ESNS, Sequoia, and Hart InterCivic. This study found what they called serious flaws in all of them. They pointed out, for example, that in the Diebold machines, the administrator smart card that allows configuration of the voting machine had a PIN, a security PIN of 1111. That would be like a bank issuing ATM cards to every customer and setting their PIN to all ones.
Not too long after this report was published in the New York Times, which was authored by Avi Rubin and the other 3, Adam Stubblefield, Yoshi Kono, and Dan Wallach, a person with inside access who had used an employee ID number to access files with Diebold leaked about 15,000 memos to David Allen. He also leaked them a couple of hours later to a freelance reporter for Wired News.
One of our freelance reporters for Wired News received a data dump from a hacker. It was 1.8 gigabytes of data taken off of a Diebold staff server. And this contains internal company emails. And those include announcements about new software coming out. There are bug announcements. It's conversations going back and forth between employees about fixes that they're making to the systems. It includes sales talk as well.
These things showed a pattern of deception. They showed a huge amount of use of uncertified, untested software. They showed some ethical violations. They showed a lot of problems with quality control. You know, you had new software releases where they were announcing 200 bugs were fixed, and the bugs were serious, like it doesn't count right.
There's a small collection of memos going back and forth where they're discussing a significant change to the software. And they're discussing the fact that the election officials will not allow this so late in the game. It's coming up very close to the election in 2002. And the solution is just to call it a bug fix and put it through.
The memos show them working around issues in the field in order to convince people to buy the machines. When problems are introduced to the engineers, they come up with workarounds just to get around the testing.
They're discussing the fact that they have sold El Paso County, Colorado, some software that didn't exist and that nobody quite figured out how to make. But they sold it. And in order to pick up the check, they needed to do a demonstration. But they didn't have anything to do the demonstration with. So he writes, for the demo, I suggest you fake it. That's what we did before. It worked well. These kinds of things. And then David Allen found one very similar ethical thing that really was disturbing in Virginia.
If I recall correctly, I think it was Portsmouth, Virginia. And they were going to be testing out some new software on the equipment that was already there. They ran into a difficulty in that the software they were getting ready to load on this equipment would not run on the existing equipment. There was a problem. And you had one manager who was saying, well, look, we're just going to have to bite the bullet on that. We're just going to have to put new equipment in that will run this software. And look, we're looking to sell them a whole bunch of voting machines, so yeah, we can take the short-term loss and you know, be upfront with the customer and tell them what the problem was and fix it. This person was then dressed down by another manager, obviously in a slightly superior position, who said, no. In essence, we're going to blame it on the customer. We're going to explain to them that it's their fault, their problem, and then we're going to put the equipment in and we're going to charge them what the market will bear.
I think the one that concerns me the most is probably the memos that come from Talbot Iredale, for a couple reasons. Because this guy's the senior vice president of research and development. He was also hired. He was one of the original hires back in 1988, and so he knows everything about every system, and he's in charge of the programmers. His memo on what really happened in Volusia County in the presidential election 2000 was a blockbuster. Understand that this is right in the middle of the election between Al Gore and George Bush.
This is, of course, when we have all the problems with Al Gore. For some odd reason, the machines reported him as having negative 16,022 votes. They have little cards that the data is recorded on when people cast their votes, and those cards are then taken to a central machine which then tallies up the total votes on them and records them. Diebel has several memos discussing this. They talk about that there was evidence that a second card was used, which would have been an unauthorized memory card.
Talbot Iredale's memo says, actually, it was a replacement set of votes. The original set of votes was on card number 0. Then a replacement set on card number 3 was put in 1 hour later. All of the races were correct except the presidential race. And in the presidential race, it took 16,022 votes away from Gore.
But no one knows where this second card came from, and no one knows where it went after the election. No one has ever been able to come up with a satisfactory explanation or to produce the card in question.
They called the election specifically because of this 16,000 votes in Volusia County. The fact that it was an error did come out, and they did correct it. But they didn't correct it until they had called the election for Bush erroneously, and Al Gore had conceded erroneously to Bush.
There is no federal agency charged with regulatory authority over the elections industry. Anybody from anywhere can own a voting machine company and can service that company.
Voting equipment is made by private companies and sold by private companies as a government procurement service. You know, there has been this very small sort of cottage industry of companies that have been selling voting equipment, and we don't know a lot about any of them. Many of them are privately held, and there's been a lot of change in ownership of these companies and questions raised about whether these companies are truly reliable, if their software is proprietary, which they insist that it must be, and if their CEOs and corporations are going to be politically involved, which many of them are.
There's been a number of revelations come forward about not only the heads of these companies and their support of certain political parties. There's also fraud in the background of these companies, in people employed by these companies and the directors of these companies.
I did this on my lunch hour. I thought, well, you know, I've got to take 20 minutes and just see if I can figure out who owns a voting machine company. It took me 10 minutes to see that Senator Chuck Hagel had owned and been the chairman and CEO of the company that counted his votes. And then I thought, well, surely he disclosed this on his disclosure documents. And he had not disclosed it. Recently he claims he did, but he did not disclose. And the extent to which he didn't disclose was really almost humorous. It would say, list every position held, whether paid or unpaid, over the last 2 years. And he would list that he was a volunteer for the Red Cross, but he would omit that he was chairman of a voting company. He would list, you know, these little volunteer or dinky things that he did, but omit that he was the CEO of the voting company. And we found out that 80% of the state of Nebraska was counted on the machines that his company built while he was the chairman of the company. You know, we got interested in Chuck Hagel and thought, well, you know, what else is involved with ES&S? But now let's start in '87, right before the '88 election. We have it purchased by McCarthy Group and Omaha World Herald. Now that sounds like a different combination for owning a voting machine. It's got an investment firm and a newspaper. So who owned Omaha World Herald? Well, it's employee owned. The biggest block of stock, and the way that it's set up, it can never be less than this big hunk. And the strongest voting rights are held actually by the Peter Kiewit Foundation. The Peter Kiewit Foundation was formed by Peter Kiewit upon his death. He owned Peter Kiewit and Sons, Inc. And Peter Kiewit Sons, Inc., if there is any entity that would be less appropriate than Chuck Hagel to own a voting machine at all, it would be Peter Kiewit. The problem with Peter Kiewit is that it has had a string of convictions for bid rigging, mail fraud, racketeering that goes on for a decade. They have also hidden their ownership in various companies. They were forbidden to bid because of their convictions. They had a couple of vice presidents go to jail. When they were forbidden to bid, they would set up another company and then say that it wasn't related to them, but then it would be found that it was. And then, so, you know, this happened in Oklahoma. And when Oklahoma found out it really was Kiewit, then they pulled the contracts from them. But it's a big company. It's very private, very secretive. And the way that it's set up, you've got Peter Kiewit Sons, Inc., which always must have a director on Peter Kiewit Foundation, which in turn has the greatest amount of stock and voting rights in Omaha World Herald, which in turn owns part of McCarthy Group. And Omaha World Herald and McCarthy Group jointly own ES&S. McCarthy Group's director is Michael McCarthy, who's Chuck Hagel's campaign finance director. He also is a director of ES&S, and he is also a director of Peter Kiewit. So you go round and round and round. So this simply underlies the issue that we need disclosure. If we're going to be privatizing this thing, we need full disclosure of everybody.
Here in the United States, you have to be an American citizen in order to vote, but you certainly don't have to be an American citizen in order to own or work at a voting machine company. And many of the voting machine companies are owned and operated by foreign agencies. The Sequoia company was originally, the parent company was a pulp recycling company by the name of Jefferson Smurfit in Ireland, and they were purchased, or their holdings in the voting part was purchased by De La Rue, which is a British company.
Sequoia is now owned by De La Rue, which is an English company, it's a British company that prints money. They were recently, in July of 2003, put under investigation by the United States Justice Department. They make smart cards and they make ATMs. They were accused by the United States Justice Department of price fixing with their smart cards. And so that's under investigation right now. Now, Sequoia has an interesting history. They've got a fellow by the name of Phil Foster. Phil Foster was indicted, but the charges were dropped. And they're eager to tell us the charges were dropped. And so I didn't even put it in the first rendition of the book because I'm not going to smear somebody if the charges were dropped. So then I started looking at, well, what was he accused of doing? Well, here was the deal. You had Phil Foster, who works for Sequoia, his brother-in-law, who lives in Alabama. He was giving Phil Foster, who works for Sequoia, manila envelopes filled with $20,000 to $40,000 of cash. His instructions were to fly to Louisiana and put this in the desk drawer of the Louisiana Elections Commissioner, Jerry Fowler. He did this 5 times. He claims that he doesn't know what was in those envelopes and he didn't realize it was wrong. My contention is this: if we have somebody who is that naive that thinks that there might be nothing wrong with taking a manila envelope with something you don't know what it is but it's shaped like cash and putting it in the desk drawer of an election commissioner, maybe this person is too naive to be around our voting machines.
The 3 largest companies are ES&S, Diebold, and Sequoia. Bob and Todd Urosevich, 2 brothers, control 2 of the top companies, ES&S and Diebold. Bob is president of the election systems division of Diebold. His brother Todd is a vice president at ES&S. Bob and Todd started a company called American Information Systems, which eventually became ES&S. Bob left American Information. He started a company called IMARC. IMARC was purchased by a Canadian company called Global Election Systems. Global Election Systems was then purchased by Diebold.
Global Election Systems was purchased by Diebold and turned into Diebold Election Systems. They started the company in 1988 as a company called North American Professional Technologies, which was actually a division of Macro Trends. You look up the word macro trends and all kinds of things break loose that you don't want to see in a voting machine company. 2 of the people who were originally with the company when it was Macro Trends, North American Professional Technologies, are still with Diebold Election Systems. So they've gone all the way through for about 15 years now. These 2 programmers' names are Guy Lancaster and Talbot Iredale. Talbot Iredale of the famous memo for Volusia County. And they were hired by 3 convicted felons. One of the guys' name is Norton Cooper. Norton Cooper was jailed by the Canadian government for defrauding the government. Another of the guys, his name was Charles Hong Lee, originally from Hong Kong. He kind of left the company around the early 90s, but their third cohort and his business partner for many years was a guy named Michael K. Gray. He became the director of Global Election Systems. He was a director for 2 years. Right before he became a director, he stole $18 million from 4 companies in Canada. He was arrested in the U.S., did 4 years there, ended up going back to Canada. He's still in jail. But these 3 guys, there's no doubt about it, they were problematical, and they hired these 2 programmers. These 2 programmers, we know from the Diebold memos, have a habit of uploading uncertified software and having it then downloaded into voting machines without it being looked at. It could be that they're, great guys, but you have to look at it. So we started looking a little more recently, and we found that there was a couple more guys we should take a look at. They live in Washington State. One of the guys' name is Jeffrey Dean. He was right up until the time that Diebold purchased the company. He was a director of Global Election Systems, and he was also its senior vice president. Jeffrey Dean did 5 years for embezzlement. The embezzlement he did was actually 23 counts of embezzlement. It involved computer fraud of a very sophisticated nature, and it involved exploiting a position of trust to manipulate computer data and embezzle money. He got out of jail in 1995. He had $87 in his account. He owed $388,000 in restitution. He got out in August, and by the end of '95, he was the owner of a printing and mailing company, which he then turned around and sold to Global Election Systems for $1 million. And here's what he did while he was with Diebold and Global Election Systems. he was hired to come into the King County database and create a voter registration system for them. He was given the passcode to the computer, the key to the computer room, and 24-hour access to the building. His friend, John Elder, who is his friend he was in prison with, that was on a drug trafficking conviction for cocaine, prints the ballots and the punch cards for not just Washington State, but for most of the country for Diebold. What this indicates is that, oh, maybe these guys are great, they're reformed and everything, but maybe we should do criminal background checks because they certainly have had a lot of access.
So there are a lot of things that, that cause one to wonder about the wisdom of handing over our voting process to private corporations.
Both Sequoia and Diebold have allowed their software to be exposed through public internet FTP sites. And you know, this from the companies who say, you should trust us, we know how to protect your ballots. Well, they can't even protect their corporate software. They leave it sitting out on internet servers. If they can't protect their own software, I don't have confidence that they can protect our ballots.
Even though we've only seen the Diebold system, there's no reason to believe that any of the other systems are any better. The federal testing authority, the authority that certifies these, had mentioned at one point that Diebold's was the best system that they had seen. Well, if we see that Diebold is a very badly programmed system, what does that say about the other systems that the authorities have seen and, in fact, have certified?
You know, in a lot of government functions, we have a lot of software used that's been privately written. So that's not a problem per se. But if you have a situation, as we do now, where there isn't a way of holding the private contractor accountable if their machines make certain kinds of mistakes, and furthermore, if you have the elections offices being intensely dependent upon the technology expertise of the vendors, I think you have a very bad situation.
Someone introduced me to the phrase regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is the condition that you have when the regulators and the regulated in an industry become so closely intertwined that the regulators only go to the regulated for information and ideas.
The area of elections has gotten so technologically complicated that registrars have had to hire computer people. And they oftentimes enter into relationships with voting companies to do certain tasks.
The regulators, the people at the state level, whether it's in California or any other state in the country, the people at the national level that are facilitating the federal testing process, the people at the local level who are buying these voting machines and deploying these voting systems, they are all friends with the representatives from the companies who sell them this voting equipment.
It's very curious, almost the vehement advocacy that many registrar of voters have for promoting these machines. And it was initially curious to me because I couldn't understand why they would support these machines in a way that you would expect a vendor to support them. When I would call them up to ask them about them, they became very defensive and they don't even want to hear about any potential harm that could come to the machines, any potential hacking, things like that. They don't even want to entertain a debate. And that just seemed very strange to me because these are our representatives. They're paid by our tax money. And I would think that they would be looking out for the voters' interests and for our tax dollars and wanting to make solid decisions about this.
What I've noticed is that the revolving door swings awfully fast between the voting equipment companies and the election officials. I can think of off the top of my head 5 former elections officials from the state of California who now work as representatives and salespeople for the voting equipment companies.
So then it becomes not such a surprise after all why these people would be so supportive of the machines.
The mark of a legitimate government is one that has earned the informed consent of the governed. And the way that you win that informed consent is through elections. And you can only have free and fair elections when they're conducted in plain sight, not in secret, which is the case right now.
Even if elections were perfect using computers, it's also important that we feel that we're a part of the process. And I think that by pushing ourselves away, that we're moving ourselves away from the actual act of ballot casting and ballot counting, all of the things that the poll workers used to do on election day made them and the rest of us who knew those people, and they were your community members, feel some confidence in the election. By pushing these things away, there's some sort of technological elite, some guru like myself. Certainly I can understand election computers, but I wouldn't want people like myself, or even myself, in charge of elections. It should be all people in the community, and it shouldn't be pushed away just to trust these technological gurus that it's being done correctly. Everyone should be accessible to elections and understand that elections are being run fairly. This is what we call transparency. And transparency in the process involves not just being able to see the code, but being able to see the entire process of the election.
What we've witnessed here with the whole debolt scenario is a complete and utter lack of transparency. This company went out, hid out in their labs, developed a voting machine without any security expertise, without any government requirements on them, and didn't have to pass any kind of rigorous security certification. And lo and behold, their systems are out in the field counting votes. And when anybody asks them, how does the machine work? Can we see the design of the machine? Can we see the code? The voting machine companies say, no, that's proprietary.
We shouldn't be in the position of having to prove somehow the machines can be hacked, although I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining how that can be done. The vendors ought to be proving to us that the machines can't be hacked or that they haven't been hacked, and they've totally fallen down on that.
We had transparent voting systems that anybody, no matter how smart you were, if you cared and you wanted to understand what was going on, you could figure it out. You could go watch the ballots being counted. And people do watch the ballots being counted. And we had a window into the voting system, and it's like that window's been shuttered and there's broken glass all over the floor. Suddenly we can't peer in anymore, and we have to just take the elections officials and these vendors at their word that everything's coming out all right, and that's not good enough.
The fact that these vendors are so closely entwined in the whole election process is a little disturbing. Elections officials are relying on Diebold and ES&S and Sequoia and these companies to explain their systems to them. When there are glitches on election night, when problems happen, these Diebold employees are there and they're giving information and they're explaining to people what to do, how to restart machines, how to re-upload if there's a glitch here, if there's a problem with the database. The employees are there.
There you go. Okay. Now, there you go. In touch review. Review shows you exactly who you voted for.
Oh, okay.
Now for the fall, we've got a certification package that's going up now. For the fall, this screen will automatically come up at the end.
Well, in a simpler America, I guess I would say it this way, that we used to count votes at the precinct by hand. That a group of senior citizens most often would gather around a table, open up the wooden ballot box, dump the ballots out, and count the X's on the paper. That didn't take a whole lot of training to do.
Our polling places are staffed by these people who essentially are volunteers. We have a hard time recruiting them in the first place, and a lot of our polling places in California are in people's garages and in churches and in other places that may not have the most reliable source of electricity. The voting machines that we currently use in California, the computerized voting machines, are very heavy and they need to be delivered to polling places. With the older punch card systems, the poll workers would get the voting equipment all loaded into their car and drive it to the polling place, and that poll worker would be responsible for that equipment. With the touchscreen voting machines, the voting machines are being delivered to polling places, again, maybe someone's garage or in a church or some other public building, the day or a couple days before the election, and they're sitting overnight. They have this tiny, cheap little plastic seal on the back that the poll workers are supposed to make sure isn't broken, but you can buy them on the internet for like 29 cents each. It's not, you know, it's not, if you wanted to commit fraud, it's not hard.
These machines introduce a lot of complexities for poll workers who in the past didn't have to worry about anything more than setting up a punch card machine and taking the ballots and handling the roster.
The training of poll workers is critical. they make it or break it on election day. It doesn't so much matter whether you're young or old or male or female or what your race is. It's the quality of that training that the registrar puts on and the willingness of the audience to receive that.
I live in Alameda County, which is one of the first counties to go system-wide with electronic voting in California. The county purchased 4,000 machines last year at a cost of about $12 million. So I was very interested to see these machines in action. What happened was I had been interviewing the Registrar of Voters for Alameda County. And she had told me that they were going through the training process for poll workers, and I asked if I could participate in that. So I went to the training session. It was about a 3-hour training session in which they went through all of the processes, and they allowed us to do a hands-on with the machines. Most of it was about, the training was about using provisional ballots, about handling people who are out of line, things like that, and all of the procedures that you have to do. But the actual hands-on work on these machines was 15 minutes. We were supposed to go through a procedure of loading the election, starting up the election, doing a little voting, and then closing down the election. Most of the groups, we were in groups of 3, were not able to complete that sequence in the 15 minutes. Why? Because they were having trouble just getting the machine started in some cases. They were having trouble loading the voter access cards. There were 3 groups of people working on the machines who put the supervisor card in instead of the voter access card. They put the supervisor card in there and disabled the device.
They are being taught sort of in a linear fashion. You do this, you do this, you do that.
If you make a mistake or change your mind, you just touch that box again and the check mark goes away.
Right here?
Right, and all the circles come back.
That's great.
Review. The screen shows you exactly who you're voting for.
But they're not trained at all in keeping an eye out for and doing anything about any of the kind of risks associated with computerized voting. There might not even be a phone in the polling place.
At the morning when the poll opens at 6 a.m., the poll supervisor runs a 0 tally on each machine at the precinct. What this essentially means is that they do a printout on each machine that indicates that there are no votes currently stored on the machine. The poll worker is supposed to show the first voter in line these 0 counts as a certification that these machines are all 0. So I arrived at 6 a.m. because I wanted to be that first voter at my precinct to see those 0 tallies. But when I arrived, the poll workers were quite frantic because one of their colleagues hadn't shown up. And the poll supervisor was trying to get the machines daisy-chained and all connected, and he wasn't succeeding very well. And so he asked me, as I'm standing there, if I would help them. And I explained to him that I had gone through the poll worker training, and so I knew how to do it, and he was quite relieved. And he asked me if I could stay, and he knew that I was a reporter, and he asked me if I could stay and help them. And I ended up staying until around 4:30 that afternoon. I was the most trained person at my precinct. And even though there was a person who was actually supposed to be the poll supervisor, I was answering a lot of questions for voters that he couldn't answer, and I was answering a lot of questions for him that he couldn't answer. People didn't know, for instance, whether or not the votes were stored on the card that they take out of the machine. They were concerned. Well, if I take the card out and it's got all my votes on it and I hand it back to you, what happens if you lose that card? So this is basic information that poll workers aren't given. I had read the SAIC report, I had read the Johns Hopkins report, and one of the criticisms that both Diebold and the SAIC report had was that there were a lot of things mentioned by the Johns Hopkins researchers that couldn't be done because poll supervisors and workers would notice it. And basically I was able to confirm that that's not the case at all. As a poll supervisor or a poll worker, you're highly overworked. You have an influx of people all at one time. Many of them have special circumstances. Their name isn't on the roster list. They've brought in an absentee ballot that you have to take care of, or there's something else wrong and you have to give them a provisional ballot. So at any time, you're preoccupied with a lot of things going on, a lot of people asking questions. They're asking questions about the machines. You're trying to show them how to insert the card. You're trying to explain things for them. And there was absolutely no way that I could have monitored anyone committing fraud on these machines.
Even before there were studies from computer scientists who were saying that there's something wrong with the software of the major manufacturers of voting machines, or because there were outcries from one jurisdiction or another that votes had been lost, it was apparent to me as a physicist, a technical sort of person, that things could go wrong. And it is as much that things could go wrong as that they actually do go wrong that means that we need another kind of audit, a backup, or in the case of my bill, a voter-verified paper trail that serves as the real backup, the solid backup for an electronically recorded vote.
A dependable voting system is one that can be verified. And you can't verify a computerized voting system if it's entirely paperless, entirely computerized. The software is totally proprietary, secret, not open to public inspection. You can't verify that election.
The big problem with touchscreen voting is that you can't recount it. I mean, the computer says, I counted 1, 2, 3, and no matter how many times you ask the computer, it's going to say, I counted 1, 2, 3. Maybe the voter marked 3, 2, 1, but there's no way to see that because there's nothing. It's off in cyberspace. There's no ballot. Here's my ballot. Here's how the people voted. We've had a contest that were 3 votes apart. We sat down, took out the vote, took out the ballots, and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lo and behold, there were 3 votes difference. I mean, you can do that. You can't do that with a touchscreen machine.
So that's why so many people believe it's essential that we have this voter-verified paper audit trail that we can use to make sure that what goes inside that touchscreen machine is what the voter intended.
Voter verifiable audit trail, sort of the most general definition, is that when you vote, a permanent record is made of your vote. And you can check that that permanent record is made correctly, which means you have to have some trustworthy way of doing that. So an obvious way to do that is your permanent record is on paper, and the mechanism you use to verify it is your eyeballs. Then that record has to be saved so they can do a recount. For various reasons, you don't want to give it to the voter to take away from the polling place because people worry about vote selling and coercion. Your boss says you have to vote for somebody, bring back the proof that you voted for that person, for example. So you don't allow that to happen. You keep the thing.
If we have a piece of paper that the voter gets to see, and it's very important that they not only see it, but that they have the opportunity to spoil it and say, no, that piece of paper is wrong, shred it, or whatever you do to it to make it go away, and then produce a piece of paper that's right. And then we need surprise recounts in some of the districts so that we can catch the case where the pieces of paper don't match the electronic tally.
If there's a recount, you recount the paper ballots. So in effect, you've spent $3,000 for a machine to mark a ballot that will then be hand counted. So, it's a $3,000 pencil. Maybe the newest technology isn't the best technology. Maybe it's just, the fanciest.
It's interesting that the strongest proponents of a voter-verified paper trail around the country are computer scientists. They're not afraid of computers. They just understand that there is a gap between the casting of the vote and the recording of the vote. And I think it can be fixed in a way that will maintain the confidence of voters, which is the goal of this. It's even in the title of my bill, which is the Voter Confidence and Accessibility Act.
The movement toward verifiable voting systems is not just about the voter-verified paper trail. I mean, the voter-verified paper trail is a cornerstone of the movement. But you can't stop there because you also need to make sure that we have routine verification of automated vote totals. And if we have that voter-verified paper trail, but you don't do anything with it, if it just sits there and you don't ever count it, then you still have the same risks of vote fraud or accidental vote counting problems going undetected.
The Voter Verification Act, or the Voter Confidence and Accessibility Act, would primarily provide a voter-verified paper trail. So each voter would be able to verify, to validate that the vote that is recorded is the same as the vote that the voter intended to cast. And that paper trail will be the vote of record, so that if there's a recount, that would be what is counted. The legislation would also require that the software for electronic voting machines be available for inspection, not be proprietary. And it also calls for a mandatory spot check surprise audit recount in 1/2% of the voting places.
The thinking among some election officials seems to be that, you know, that image that we saw of the election workers in Florida counting those punch card ballots and holding them up to the light and checking them for dimpled and pregnant and hanging chads and all that business, that we could make that image a thing of the past by eliminating paper ballots altogether. And that seems to be, you know, that's where we went wrong, because, you know, I think if people thought about it a little bit, they'd realize that as excruciating as that point in our history was, that waiting for that vote count, I was very happy, and I'm sure many other people were happy, that there was a paper record at all. And the next time that happens, there won't be any paper ballots to hold up to the light and check carefully. It'll all be inside the machine, and rather than it being hundreds of people counting those ballots in plain sight, it'll be 1 or 2 people counting them essentially in the back room.
My greatest fear is that we won't have a basis for trusting elections anymore. It's not that there'll be widespread fraud or that there'll be visible fraud. It's that every single election there will be some question, or every close election, there'll be some question about who really won. And if you have a situation where in every election there's a question about whether the losers lost or not, I think you lose the property where you're governing with the consent of the governed. And I think that will lead to certainly increased cynicism and maybe even social unrest.
With today's technology, I do not think it's possible to design an all-electronic system. And one of the reasons for that is that we do not have the ability to neither manually nor automatically look at computer code and have any idea what it does. Computer code is complex and large and unreadable, and until we have some mechanism for verifying and validating and getting some assurance in computer code, we have no way to know what it really does. And so we cannot go to an all-electronic system.
If somebody says there's no way to make sure that these machines don't have malicious code on it, you could listen to 200 of the top computer scientists in the world, or you could listen to, say, the lobbyist for the League of Women Voters, or a salesman from a voting machine company. So who are you going to pay attention to? A lot of people are paying attention to the salesman and the lobbyists, but we're doing the best we can.
Voting systems are very different from other systems. You have average individuals without PhDs in computer science who are voting, and they need to have a reason to have confidence in the system. And just because the computer scientists are saying, yeah, trust us, we looked at it, it's good, you shouldn't have to trust computer scientists. We don't want them running the world. And you shouldn't have to trust politicians. You should be able to verify for yourself and get some reasonable confidence and reason to believe that your vote counted and that there's some hope that in a recount your vote will continue to count.
People have to act now. I mean, basically, elections have been handed over to the election community, which consists of vendors, election officials, and the people who orbit around them. Not universally, but as a rule, they're gung-ho for this conversion to touchscreen machines. Whether that, stopping that is going to depend on the American people. We've tried everything else. We've tried talking to the politicians and having them listen to the computer scientists, and they didn't. And so it has to be a grassroots effort to persuade the people that represent us that this is not what we want. We want a system we can trust. And that's what has to happen.
At the time this program was prepared, invisible ballots were already a fact of life in thousands of local communities. By the time this message reaches you, the number will undoubtedly have grown, perhaps to the point where it may seem that it's too late to do anything about it. It's also possible that mounting public pressure will force machine manufacturers and their political allies to admit the weaknesses of their system and promise future improvements. Promises they may have no intention of keeping, but which are designed primarily to silence their opposition while they continue with their task. Once the systems are installed at great cost to the taxpayers, then they can argue that the promised improvements are still a good idea, but unfortunately much too costly to be practical. After a while, the public is expected to become weary of the issue and gradually accept the paperless machines as here to stay. So what can be done about it? Actually, it's very simple. Invisible ballots are the result of an act of Congress and the acceptance of federal funding by the states. That means they can also be banished by Congress and rejected by the states. The purpose of this program is to awaken the electorate to that necessity. The potential loss of our vote through high technology is one of the most critical issues we will face in the next decade, and we must insist that it becomes a top priority in all political debates. That means we must not let candidates sidestep or straddle this issue. We must not let them play word games with maybe yes and maybe no. We must hold their feet to the fire until they declare unequivocally in favor of a system that, regardless of its technology, whether expensive machines or inexpensive paper systems, produces a permanent record that voters can see and verify at the time their votes are cast. The message we must deliver is simple. Invisible ballots are a bad idea. Visible ballots are the only way to guarantee the integrity of our vote and the future of our freedom.